Kia ora and welcome back to the HRPI. I'm Marie Tovio, recording from my office where real HR investigations unfold. Today's case file is the Confidentiality Code. What can be shared at work, what must stay private, and how to avoid the common mistakes that can turn an HR issue into a legal one. Because in employment relations, confidentiality isn't just a nice to have. Handled well, it protects people and process. But handled badly, it can destroy trust, compromise fairness, and create legal risk. First, confidentiality and privacy are not the same thing. Let's clear this up early because these two concepts are often mixed up. Confidentiality is about who should know what and why. Employment agreements will often include a confidentiality clause, which reinforces the workplace expectation and clarifies the types of confidential information an employee may come across in their role. In New Zealand, even without a written clause, employees will usually still owe an implied duty of confidentiality under common law, not to misuse or improperly disclose their employer's confidential information. Privacy under the Privacy Act 2020 is about how personal information is collected, stored, used and disclosed. So, here's the key difference. Confidentiality is often a workplace rule, privacy is a legal framework, and importantly, confidentiality does not override privacy rights, and privacy does not mean you can't run a fair employment process. That's where HR judgment really matters. In most New Zealand workplace confidentiality situations, the key legislation that helps define our obligations are the Privacy Act. This applies when you're handling personal information, things like complaints, investigation notes, medical information, disciplinary records, performance concerns, salary details, even informal manager notes about an employee. Under the Privacy Act, you need to be clear about why you're collecting the information, how you'll use it, who it may be shared with, and how it'll be stored securely. 2. Employment Relations Act. The ERA is relevant because it requires good faith, fair process, and that employers act as a fair and reasonable employer could in the circumstances. And here's the key part. If you're taking action that could negatively affect an employee, like a warning, dismissal, or even a restructure decision, they must be given a genuine opportunity to respond, which usually requires sharing enough information with them. That means you can't hide behind confidentiality to avoid fairness. 3. Health and Safety at Work Act. This comes into play when confidentiality intersects with things like bullying complaints, harassment, psychosocial risks, safety incidents, or any situation where people may be at risk. Sometimes you must take steps to keep people safe, even if that means limited disclosure to implement controls. 4. Defamation and reputational risk. Even if you're not thinking legal claim, reputational damage matters. Publicly naming someone or sharing allegations casually can create serious harm and significant liability. So what does confidentiality look like in practice? Here's the best practice definition I use with clients. Confidentiality means information is shared only with those who have a legitimate need to know for a lawful and work-related purpose. That's it. Not secrecy, not gossip control, not HR knows everything and no one else gets told anything. It's about purpose and proportionality. And what's the biggest confidentiality mistake I see? Let's get practical because there do seem to be some common traps that catch even the good employers out. Mistake 1, oversharing. This often happens when leaders are stressed and want support, so they vent to the wrong person. Examples, telling another manager about a disciplinary outcome, just so you know, sharing complaint details with someone who's not involved, discussing employee performance in an open plan office, emailing sensitive information without thinking about who's copied in, Oversharing damages trust and can breach the Privacy Act. Mistake 2, undersharing. This is the opposite. When an employer says, we can't tell you anything because it's confidential. But if an employee is accused of something and you don't provide enough detail for them to respond, for example, you risk procedural unfairness. In investigations and disciplinary processes, the principle is share enough for the person to understand the allegation and respond meaningfully. Don't share irrelevant details or personal information about others that they don't need. What about need to know? Who counts? This depends on the situation, but typically legitimate need to know people include the employee themselves, and in some situations the employee's representative, the decision maker, often their manager or a more senior manager, HR or people and culture, an investigator, either internal or external, witnesses, but only what's relevant to their involvement, payroll, if there are pay changes, health and safety personnel, if risk controls are required, for example. It does not include the employee's workmates because they're curious, other managers just in case, friends, partners, or external parties without a lawful purpose. So what about investigations and confidentiality? This is where it gets sensitive. A lot of organisations tell employees, this is confidential, do not discuss it with anyone. But here's the nuance. You can reasonably expect confidentiality to protect the integrity of the process, but employees may still need to talk to their support person, union, employment advocate or lawyer, and in some cases a health professional. So best practice is to say something like, please keep this matter confidential and only discuss it with your support person or representative. Do not discuss it with colleagues or other parties, as that may compromise the process. It's clear, fairer, and more realistic. I often get asked, can we tell the team? If an employee is suspended, removed from duties, or is suddenly absent, staff will notice. You don't have to lie to them, but you also shouldn't overshare with them. As an example, a safe approach could be, X is currently not at work. Please direct any operational questions to me. And if it's impacting workload, you can add details about how you plan to reallocate duties. Under the Privacy Act, employees can request access to personal information held about them, but that doesn't mean they automatically get other people's private information or full details where it might be about others. Often, information may need to be reviewed carefully, partially withheld, or even redacted. This is an area where I strongly recommend getting advice, because mishandling information can create risk either way. Let's look at practical steps you can take to protect confidentiality properly in your workplace. Have clear policies, a code of conduct, a privacy and confidentiality policy, and these should explain expectations and consequences. Train your leaders. Most confidentiality breaches are not malicious. They're made by untrained, busy staff and managers. Use secure systems, password-protected files, more than one authentication step, restricted access, and clear retention rules. Be consistent. If you protect one person's confidentiality but not another's, people lose trust fast. Think carefully about the requirements before you share. Ask, who needs this information? For what purpose? What's the risk if it is shared inappropriately? And in terms of when you should seek help, my rule of thumb is if the situation involves complaints, investigations, potential discipline, or a potential restructure, medical information, or reputational risk, get advice early, especially if you're asking yourself, do we have to tell them who complained? Can we share the witness statements? What can we tell the team? Can we redact this? Is this a privacy breach? Can we discipline someone for discussing it? Those are the situations where one wrong step can undo an otherwise fair process. So, here are today's key takeaways. Confidentiality is about need to know, not secrecy. Privacy is a legal obligation under the Privacy Act 2020. Fair process under the Employment Relations Act often requires disclosure, but only what's relevant. Oversharing and undersharing are both risky. If in doubt, pause and get advice early. If you'd like support with policies, investigation processes, or wording for either confidentiality or privacy that actually works in practice, feel free to reach out. And you can also find HR policy templates and resources on my website. The information in this podcast is provided as a general overview of key employment topics in New Zealand and does not replace tailored advice. Every situation is different and the appropriate steps can vary depending on the specific circumstances. If you're unsure about how to proceed in your workplace, I encourage you to seek advice and support. Feel free to get in touch with me directly. That wraps up today's case file. Until next time, stay fair, stay curious, and stay compliant. Mā te wā.